had the privilege to actually speak to Brett Weinstein, who's an evolutionary biologist, and I asked him a very specific question about the purpose of music. So he was kind of looking at it through an evolutionary lens, and I wanted to get your take on it because he pointed out two very interesting things to me. And one of them was that obviously, typically, evolutionarily speaking, emotion will regulate behavior in the sense that if something makes you feel sad, you'll usually stop doing that thing that made you feel sad. And one thing he pointed out was that music um, does evoke the same emotion, and we actually seek it out actively. I was curious to have your take on it as a composer. Why would you want to even evoke that in the listener?
Well, it's sadness, but it's like it's sadness in a zoo, right? It's sadness that you can go and visit, and it's behind a cage, and it's not going to kill you, and it's not associated with an actual tragic event. It's metaphoric, right? And so I think there's a tremendous utility in being able to voluntarily experience different emotional states through artworks. One of the things that is really cool about classical symphonies, for example, is that they attempt to present you with a picture of the whole human being, with the range of passions that a human being can experience. So a classical symphony typically has four movements. The first movement is the intellectual movement. It's the movement in which you have the highest degree of complexity. You have a dialectical principle in the first movement, where you have contrasting harmonic regions, contrasting themes, and then they're worked out through a dialectical process, a kind of conversation, if you like, between different materials. The second movement is typically a slow movement, and that would be the heart movement. It's the lyrical movement. It's the one that is the most overtly emotional. The third movement will tend to be a scherzo or a minuet or something along those lines. In other words, a dance movement. So that's the feet, that's the body
The
moving,
body.
that's the body
Interesting.
space. Then the last movement typically has something lighter in tone in it. Often it's a rondo, it's another dance basically. It might even be faster than the third movement, but there's something lighter about it, generally speaking. So you have like a kind of entertainment component in it or a dance component to it. You have a heart component to it. You have an intellect component to it and so on. So it's like you're addressing the entire person. And that's something that I think is really quite attractive about classical music, is this attempt to create an entire kind of cosmology of inner space, so to speak, of the range of human experiences.
Would you say that you've been exposed to or can name maybe other songs, music, etc., whether it's jazz, pop, whatever, that kind of accomplish the same thing? That holistic, as you say, mind, body, etc. Or do you think it's unique to the classical craft, in other words?
I wouldn't be able to make a claim like that because there are gaps in my knowledge
Okay.
of world musical cultures. I would say that in terms of other forms of Western musical expression, typically a piece tries to do one thing in specific, but it doesn't necessarily try to address the entire human experience. Not that the classical pieces actually literally do that, of course. It's kind of a it's you have to see that more metaphorically, I think, in terms of presenting a very complete or a very broad range of different types of expression within one piece. But it obviously isn't exhaustive.
Right.
But most of the time, particularly in commercial music, in folk music, in popular music, in jazz, um, typically a given piece will have one particular overarching characteristic to it. It'll either be fast and rhythmic, it might be harmonically complex, it might be more lyrical in nature, um, it might be more introspective in nature, etc. But it would be unusual for a piece, particularly a shorter piece, I think, to try to do all of those things at the same time or even successively.
Right. Right. Okay. Very cool. Um,
Well, you
uh,
run into issues of duration, right? Because a symphony can be half an hour long, or a really long romantic symphony can be 60 or 70 minutes long.
mm,
Whereas the sorts of formats that we're usually encountering, there are exceptions in things like modal jazz, of course, where you get really long
right.
pieces, but a lot of the time you're working on relatively short duration.
Right. Actually, that's another point that I've heard you discuss. It was sort of that the contrast between the attendance for example, this an abstract art exhibit in New York, and a musical and a classical concert, for example, where the thing about the painting, as you pointed out, was that if someone doesn't like the painting, they just walk past it. Whereas if they don't like the symphony and it's 20 minutes long or whatever, they have to sit there for the 20 minutes. So that's interesting as well. Th That kind of leads me to the next interesting point was the way that music is consumed. Um, how much of a part do you think that plays in sort of, it's hard to explain, but the fact that it's digitized, that we're in the digital age and everyone can just at a click listen to whatever they want from wherever they want essentially. Do you think that impacts anything at all, or not at all? Does it actually widen the scope, or does it make us in, does it put us in silos instead? Like what do you think is happening there?
It's hard to see how it wouldn't affect things in a very profound way.
Hmm,
You could look at this in the light of what happened in the 19th century around the Industrial Revolution. That had profound and far-reaching consequences for music. It changed absolutely everything. One of the big things that the Industrial Revolution changed was that you no longer had to be able to play an instrument in order to have music in your house. So it used to be the case that if you were in a reasonably well-off middle-class family, of which there were not many in the 19th century, that didn't really start to happen until later. But in any case, if you were in that scenario, then the odds were that you, as part of your education, you would learn to play an instrument. After the Industrial Revolution, it became possible for all kinds of people in a broad range of social situations to purchase a phonograph or whatever and buy recordings and play those at home. Or, in some cases, you could buy a player piano or something like that and play rolls in your house.
right.
So you didn't actually need to know how to play the piano. You could buy a machine that would do that for you.
Yeah.
So that had profound implications. It meant that the audience for music was vastly wider than it had been up to that point. So suddenly you had millions of people interested in music rather than, say, a few thousand or whatever. Obviously, these
Yeah,
numbers are heuristics, but
of course.
it meant that the audience could be far broader than it had been up to that point. It also meant that you could have a much broader range of musical styles on offer to the public. So you start to see the emergence of large numbers of different styles, really highly individualistic styles coming out also, with composers developing really quite personal and idiosyncratic languages, which hadn't really been the case to nearly the same extent up to that point. And this really starts to take off around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when suddenly there's this explosion of all of these different contrasting approaches to composition, some of which are really idiosyncratic, personal, and experimental in nature. But you can do that because there's a huge audience suddenly. It's much easier to disseminate music. It's much easier to write a piece, have it recorded. It doesn't need to be performed 100 times. You can just perform it once and record it, and then thousands of people can hear it. And what we're seeing now, I don't think it's a I don't think it's a paradigm shift exactly, because the principle is the same. The idea is still that you can record a piece of music and disseminate it electronically to a wider number of people than would be the case otherwise. But we're seeing a dramatic acceleration in the ease with which that can be done, and also just the number of people that can access it. And that has, of course, very profound consequences. The other thing that is a profound consequence is the fact that it's become quite a lot harder to monetize musical production than was the case in the past. So people are accustomed to being able to pay $10 a month for a Spotify subscription and get virtually anything that's ever been recorded available to them for free whenever they want. So how are you supposed to make money off recordings then? So that's a problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved, because if there's no financial incentive for record companies to invest in artists and to spend money producing recordings, then how is that going to continue to happen?
Right. And
So it's complicated.
I'm curious, do you believe that that kind of market pressure, let's say, makes the sort of live experience more valuable?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's made it more valuable. I think it's made it more rare in the sense that people are far likelier to hear something through some kind of electronic mediation now than they are to hear it in a live setting. So just to give one example, if a new piano piece of mine is premiered somewhere, there might be 200 people in the audience. If I put it on YouTube, or if somebody else puts it on YouTube, it'll get tens of thousands of views. That wouldn't have been possible 50 years ago.
Right.
So that certainly changes things, but it also means that the vast majority of people, like 1% or less, are going to be hearing it live compared to the number of people that are going to hear it on the internet.
Right. Right.
So I don't know if that makes people value the live experience more, but I think people are just accustomed to the way that recorded music sounds. And something I've often heard is uh, people who maybe aren't used to attending concerts of live music. Sometimes when they go to hear an orchestra for the first time, they're actually disappointed because it doesn't have that immediacy and that vividness, and it's not, the sound isn't compressed and it's not mixed and so on, and it's not in your headphones, and it's not right, coming from inside your skull. So it sounds a little bit more maybe distant than they might be expecting. It's not as overwhelmingly uh, physical as maybe the experience you might be able to have with the surround sound system in your home. So that's kind of weird.
Well, another thing, so I guess we can get a bit less abstract here because I was curious about this as well. I heard you talking about constraints and sort of the creative process and how one motive, sorry, one method a composer might want to start to compose is by setting up parameters. What do you think it is about constraints and parameters that maybe inspires creativity?
Well, it's not that they help, it's that you can't do anything without them. They're actually necessary, because if you don't put some kind of boundary around what the piece can do, then in a certain sense you're not really making a piece. There are instances of composers attempting not to do that and seeing how far they can go in terms of deliberately not creating material and not creating constraints. So John Cage would be an example of that. I think he goes pretty much as far as he possibly could in that direction, and still claim to be creating works in
Right,
some sense or another. But for the most part, you need to put a boundary around the piece because you can't act otherwise. There will be no basis upon which to make a meaningful decision as a creative person. So one of the things that I've often found is that the more draconian the constraint, the more it tests you, the more it forces you to come up against the limits of what you're able to say, the more productive that is, paradoxically. So everybody deals with constraints when they're making something creative, whether they realize it or not. It might be a constraint that is voluntarily adopted because you're working within a particular genre, for example.
right,
So, right, so if you're working in a kind of bebop direction, then that's automatically a constraint. So that limits uh, the type of appropriate instrumentation. It limits the harmonic language to something that it makes sense within that direction. It limits the types of rhythmic figures you can use, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all kinds of constraints in the sense that there's a million things that you now can't do because you're working within that genre. So I think the difference is we don't typically think of that as being a constraint necessarily, but in
right,
fact it is. It amounts to the same thing as working within a genre consciously.
right. So you could have voluntary constraints, but you could also have your own limitations, which may end up pushing you in certain directions as well. Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, Now, in terms of composition, staying with this for a moment, I was kind of curious about. So I listened recently. The most exposure I got to your work was Trois pierres à ne pas jeter. I just heard
Mhm.
that yesterday. I was listening to it, and I was curious what sort of how you approach composition. Let's say for that piece, because it sounded very was quite eerie, in my opinion anyway. I don't know. I felt a certain darkness, suspense, eeriness, etc. So I was curious what the idea was. So did you start with a specific thing in mind? Did you start with a scene in mind? Did you start with just like what was the idea when you started to compose that?
Well, I don't start with an idea. I start with the desire to make something and a search for a form, if that makes any
Mm,
sense. It's the best explanation maybe I can make, or the best metaphor I can offer is it's as though you were a deep sea diver and it's really dark down there and you can't really see very well and you don't know exactly what you're interacting with. Maybe you see a blurry shape somewhere and you're trying to pull something out of this dark space
mm,
that is totally unarticulated and you don't know what the contours are and you don't know what physical properties the objects have, and but you can sense that they're there and you're trying to figure out what these things are and you can sort of intuit these shapes.
see.
And I think that's how my process works, right? I start with the desire to make something. That's it. That's all I have to start with. That's it. But I don't know what I'm going to make. And then you start playing with the materials that you have and the parameters of the project. It's like,
Right.
okay, I know I have to write a violin concerto. I know I have this many instruments to work with. I know the piece has to be approximately this length. And then you start thinking, okay, what can I do within that space that would be interesting? What new shapes could I invent? What new textures and atmospheres and expressive worlds could I invent? And then you start by creating very, very vague things. You start trying to find an inroads into that world. And it's like an accretion process where you'll be improvising and trying things out, and then something will stick and something will manifest to you as being an idea that has potential. And then you start to try to define that a little bit more and solidify it and see where can I take this, how far can I push it. And then different ideas will become associated with the first one, and it's like a reactive process.
Yeah, would you say there's a bit of co-creation in there? Where you kind of
What
influence the piece, but then it sort of influences you back, and then it keeps bouncing back and forth. Would you say there's an element of that?
well, music doesn't just spring forth from my inner being. I mean,
Mm,
music is a collective possession that belongs to everybody, and it's a world that millions of people have added to over the centuries. So I didn't invent the violin. I didn't
right.
invent the format of the chamber concerto. I didn't invent the 12 note chromatic scale. I didn't invent any of the instruments that I'm writing for. I didn't invent the system of notation. I didn't invent the tuning system. I didn't invent any of these things. And I didn't invent the history of music either, and all of the associations that violin concertos can have, and just the sound of a violin and the technical possibilities of a violin. All of those things are like a common property that I'm working with as I make my piece. So there's obviously a certain amount of it that comes from me, from my experiences, and from my particular abilities and inabilities and limitations that get into it. But then there's also the dialogue between myself and my particular personal misreading of music history and my idiosyncratic tendency of finding this interesting rather than this.
Right.
So it is a symbiotic process, I would say. It's a dialogue between what's already being done and then the particular things that I can bring to that situation.
So, in terms of, I mean, we spoke a little bit about the way music is distributed and how that might affect certain things. If someone were to want, let's say, pursue a career as a composer, what do you believe would be the first step for them? Now, let's say they're a music major, they've studied their craft, they know how to compose, technically speaking. What do you think would be a good way for them to have some works and have them performed, or at least listened to?
Well, I think the first step would be to not go to university.
Hmm.
That would be step number one, especially now. And then step number two would be make sure that you understand the ecosystem of um, of social media because that's absolutely crucial.
Interesting. Can you
And
elaborate on both of those actually?
well, fundamentally, you have to you have to wonder. you have to think about why a composer would go to university in the first place, because historically that wasn't the case. You went to university if you wanted to study musicology, although even that is a comparatively young discipline. It hasn't been around for very long. Um, in the past, the composers would learn their craft or their trade or their art, however you want to call it, through an apprenticeship system where you would go and work with an established master. And part of that would be perhaps that you would be their assistant, or you would help them out with certain tasks, and then in exchange for that, you would receive lessons or something like that. But so why would a composer necessarily belong in a academic environment? So an academic environment is geared towards research, and obviously there are many disciplines in which it makes sense to take that approach. But composition isn't really about research, at least not in the academic sense of the term. So the reason that we're there, I think, why so many people study composition in university is that in the United States, well, in North America in general, in the 20th century, it wasn't obvious where composers should go because you didn't have the sort of idea of a patronage from the nobility that was prominent in Europe. You didn't have a sort of caste of princes and dukes and so on, and that had the means and the cultivation to support the fine arts. In the United States, a little bit in the 1910s and 1920s, and in the interwar period, there were a lot of war widows. There were a lot of young women with a lot of money who supported composers in order to have some kind of social standing in exchange for that. That was actually relatively common, and a lot of the avant-garde and modern artists, both writers like James Joyce, Hemingway, composers like George Antheil, Ezra Pound, and so on, a lot of those people were supported by rich American heiresses in the 1920s and 30s. So that was one way forward, but that didn't last very long. And today, that system doesn't really exist. You don't have a lot of private patronage of artists anymore in North America. So it's like artists have to go somewhere and they have to be supported somehow. So in the 1950s and 1960s, composers started to realize that they could go to places like Princeton and Harvard, the Ivy League schools, and they could become professors, tenured professors, and that the protection they would receive there would allow them to pursue their work free from the pressures of the marketplace. So they would not be obliged to write commercial sounding music. They could write whatever they wanted, and they would have the security of a tenured position. So that kind of worked for a while for some composers. It absolutely doesn't work anymore, though. And the reason for that is that composition programs in North America are basically Ponzi schemes, which is to say that a given program might churn out 40 doctoral students a year. Those 40 doctoral students, and that's just for one program, right? There might be hundreds of programs throughout the country. The problem is there might only be one or two positions a year that open up. What is everybody else who has a doctoral degree in composition supposed to do? And what we're seeing is every single person who graduates from these programs, and some of them are extremely skilled and talented and so on, but you can't possibly find enough work to sustain that system. So it's like you fill up the classes with as many students as possible so that the program will be financially viable. But in so doing, you're creating large numbers of graduates that have absolutely no prospects. So that's a problem. That's a huge problem, and it's one that is very dangerous for the
Yeah.
art also, I think.
Now, the second point you mentioned was, well, you would encourage people to sort of embrace the current, let's say, tools at our disposal to promote our music, et cetera, et cetera. So you mentioned social media. Obviously, becoming more social media literate, quote unquote, is an asset. Um, why? And I've heard you speak about this briefly. Like, for example, the sort of reticence that some composers may have uh, about coming onto YouTube, for example. Why do you think that is, and what what do you think was, let's say, the thing that convinced you to start? What made you different on that about that? Yeah.
The reticence is easy to understand because social media is simultaneously a great gift and a very dangerous type of poison. So, and we don't know which it is really, because it can be both of those things. So there are lots of people that have their lives destroyed on social media. But at the same time, it does amazing things like, it creates opportunities for free public education on practically any topic you can imagine. And it puts people in contact with each other in a way that can be very productive. So the reticence is easy to understand. It's also, if you go onto social media and you start to get a bit of a presence, then you're immediately exposed. People know what you think, and they can criticize it. And they can criticize it on a grand scale. If I put up a video and it gets 200,000 views, then I can be instantly made fun of. I can be ridiculed. I can be criticized. I can be exposed for being the fraud that I am, and so on. It's very, very easy for that to happen, and it doesn't take much also for that sort of reaction to happen.
The madness of the crowd. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So you can avoid all of that by simply not going onto social media and just sort of pretending that it doesn't exist, and as though the music world still functions the way it did 50 years ago. The problem, of course, though, is that social media, whether you like it or not, whether you're literate in it or not, is determining the way the way the world goes on every level. So I think you can't really ignore it. You can have it affect you and not be aware of that, and not be aware of how it's affecting you, or you can try to become aware of how it works and try to steer it in a good direction.
Would you say that someone starting off today should absolutely, let's say, embrace YouTube, Instagram, et cetera, even in the classical stream? How relevant do you believe that is? Or do you believe that it's well, I imagine you do believe that it's probably more relevant for other types of music because of audience size. Is that correct?
I'd hesitate to use the word should, because there's something moralistic about that, that I would know what's best for these people, and
Right.
I don't. There are, of course, exceptions. There are people who aren't particularly active on social media, and who still have fulfilling and successful careers.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't make that generalization. I would say that I don't think really it matters anymore what particular genre you're working in, or what style you're working in. I don't think that is at all relevant anymore, because it's just present for everything now. And
Right.
symphony orchestras have their own YouTube channels and make very impressive content, very beautifully produced multi-camera setups for their videos and so on. Um, so there isn't a single corner of the music world that hasn't been profoundly transformed by social media. So again, you can be aware of that fact, and you can try to consciously work with it in a way that's productive, or you can be subjected to it in a way that you might not be able to control
Right.
quite as well. But I don't think that you can, sit in a corner somewhere and not be affected by it, because the transformation is far too profound.
Another thing I heard you speak about was sort of the importance of being, uh, how to say, up to date, so to speak, with regards to the music of your time, um, and that you believed, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's absolutely natural for someone to be more interested in the music of their era than the music of 200 years ago. Um, that said, I'm curious to know your thoughts about where you believe classical music is headed and what's going on right now in the sort of zeitgeist, so to speak.
I'll start with a general statement, which is that I think that a culture that is overly oriented towards the past is probably not a culture that is in very good shape. So in other words, if its main focus is on preserving and venerating what was done in the past, then it's probably a culture that isn't moving very much, or that isn't innovating very much. So that is something that you would want to be careful about. And then the other thing is, I was very careful not to say in my video that contemporary music is better than older music,
Yeah.
um, or that it's more rewarding to listen to it than older music. The point is not that it's better. The point is simply that it's a good idea to have an idea of what's happening now, even if you don't like it, even if you don't like where things are heading. I think it's still important to be informed about what's happening. Um, Ideally, you would want to have a sense of historical depth and perspective. I think that's absolutely necessary, not only for musicians and composers, but also for audience members. And but the historic depth and so on and perspective isn't important only for its own sake. It's important in as much as it illuminates our present moment, and in as much as it might help you to determine where you might want to move next. I think that if your time horizon is limited to the present and maybe a few years prior to it, then the danger is that you're not going to be able to move forward in a particularly confident way, I think, because you won't have a sense of what's already been done and what might be remaining to do. So as for where classical music is headed, well, one thing I've certainly observed is that over the past few decades, there's been a progressive breakdown of stylistic boundaries and genre boundaries. And you're seeing the emergence of new categories of musical experiences that I don't know how you would even describe them. They're sort of in between categories. There are things that are sort of partly improvised, they're partly multimedia, they're partly composed. They might have a popular dimension to them. They might be entirely written out. They might not have a score at all. You're seeing all these practices that are increasingly difficult to define. And I think that's just a natural consequence of the way we listen to music now, where you can go onto Spotify and listen to anything. And it's no harder to listen to a ethnological recording of a piece from 100 years ago that was recorded in, I don't know, in sub-Saharan Africa, or something that was recorded in the Balkan states in 1910. It's no harder to listen to that than it is to listen to the latest #1 single. Those things are equally easy to listen to because everything is available.
Right.
So there used to be an effect of scarcity or resistance. Like if you wanted to hear some of these really rare musicological recordings, you'd have to actually get the wax cylinders and have something to play them on, and you'd have to go to a building someplace and play them. Everything's accessible now. And it's all audio files. So it's just so much easier to imagine mixing things together than it would have been the case even a few decades ago.
So you think boundaries are being broken simply by nature of the way we consume music now?
Yes, well, a lot of things. I think that the dramatic acceleration of electronic communications, the ease of travel, well, maybe not the past couple of years, but
Yeah.
generally speaking, the ease of travel, um, and also the fact that Western cultures increasingly uh, seem to be rather more diffuse, and uh, it's harder to point to specific social institutions that have the same cohesive power as would have been the case maybe half a century ago. So the system of values or things that might allow you to motivate your behavior in a particular direction are a lot more diffuse now. So I think that also has consequences for music in the sense that the sorts of music that you're likely to hear in your social milieu, let's say, uh, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied with where you are socially or what sort of activities you pursue in your
Right.
daily life or what your profession is. Those things have become untethered. It's not the case that the main music you're going to hear is the music you hear at your church service or the music that you hear at a dance or whatever it is, you know. So it's just anything that happens to come through your internet connection, or anything that you see in a movie, or anything that you see in mass culture, anything that, you know,
Right.
it's just tremendous.
Regardless of what is happening locally, you mean? Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely, that's a better way of putting it. Yeah.
Right, I understand. So obviously you've spent your whole life studying and practicing music and composition. Um, what surprises you now in music? What are you interested in? What takes you by surprise?
Well, I work with approximately 30 students from around the world. I teach on Zoom, and that has profoundly changed the way I look at composition and the way I think about the world that I'm in. because there are tremendously interesting, gifted people in every part of the world that I speak with, doing work that I could not have imagined would exist 10 or 20 years ago. Work that I could not have predicted because it's aesthetically innovative, it's new, it's fresh, it's exciting, it's bringing all kinds of different influences in and weaving them together in surprising ways. I'm seeing the complete absence of any kind of ideological thinking in these students as well. They're not thinking, I should be writing this type of music. I should be going in this direction. I should be making music that appeals to this or that demographic or festival or whatever it might be. Um, some people are doing that, of course, and you're likelier to see that in the universities than outside of the universities. That's another point. But for the most part, what I'm surprised by is just the things that my students show me that I could not possibly have ever imagined would happen, and that gives me tremendous hope for the future because there's just so much to be done now. There are so many resources and there's so much technology available to everybody now. The ways that people can connect are so vastly more sophisticated than anything that we could have imagined 2 decades ago. And you're seeing a lot of composers emerge that are probably not going to have a huge audience, but they might have a micro audience that is really devoted to that particular type of music. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing necessarily in and of itself, but it does mean that I'm continually surprised and stimulated by the music that young people are sending me all the time, and that's really exciting.
Do you think it's become more possible or less possible to make a living as a composer? Or as a musician in general, maybe just a performer? What are your thoughts on that?
Depends on what you mean by making a living. If your aim is to do a composition degree, uh, achieve some kind of a stable teaching position somewhere that gives you enough stability so that you can write your music, then I think the odds of that happening are extremely low. Less than a hundredth of a percent, I would say, in most cases. Um, so it was definitely easier in that sense a few decades ago. Not a lot easier, but it was still easier a few decades ago than it is now, simply because of the vastly greater number of people all attempting to do the same thing now in graduate and postgraduate programs. So in that sense, it's gotten harder. At the same time, though, for those who are willing to embrace a non-institutional path, the opportunities are far greater than they ever have been. And for the majority of the history of Western music, this is maybe an outrageous claim, but I would argue that most of the really valuable work and the most innovative work has tended to take place in uh, very individual circumstances, let's say, or in difficult circumstances, or in extra institutional circumstances. A lot of the really exciting things that we now cherish as part of that tradition came about that way, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. So if we look at some of the big figures in 20th century music up to about 1945, a lot of them lived in absolutely atrocious circumstances. They had tragic lives. Their work was ignored, derided, made fun of. They couldn't make a living. They were, just horrible stories. You read about the life of Varese or Schoenberg or Bartok. Webern certainly was a tragic case. There are many, many such stories. And the odds that a composer nowadays is going to have to deal with anything near that level of hardship, I think is pretty unlikely,
Right.
at least in Western societies. So you're not going to see someone like Bartok, who was in danger of actually starving to death at one point. You're not going to see the life of somebody like Webern, I think, whose country was completely torn up over his lifetime, from Austria-Hungary to this little destroyed nation of Austria after the First World War, who had his son shot and killed in the Second World War, and who himself was then murdered by an American soldier accidentally immediately after the Second World War, who couldn't afford to support himself and his family, and who progressively saw any possibility for making a living as a professional musician taken away from him. I mean, it can't really get too much worse than that. So I've never encountered a single student, and I've encountered thousands of students. I haven't encountered anybody who has anything close to that level of, being that degree of disenfranchised and rejected from society and having to deal with tragic circumstances on that level.
Right.
I'm not saying there's nobody out there. I'm just saying I think it's a lot less likely to happen now. The social circumstances for people are much improved now over what they would have been 100 years ago, and that of course also has consequences for composers. The technologies that we have available to us now have made it infinitely easier to disseminate music. There's no problem of distribution. There's no problem of scarcity. I can produce a recording and create infinite numbers of replicas of that recording by putting it online. Anybody can hear it for free. So, and there are new ways to monetize artistic creation that didn't exist even a few years ago. We have Patreon. You can make a YouTube channel and you can generate revenue from ad income. You can start a podcast. You can do crowdfunding. Not that any of these things are easy, and not that any of them solve the problem of being an artist and trying to make a living. It's very easy to fail at these things, and it's very hard to make a living at them. But nevertheless,
Right.
there are new possibilities.
Right. So sort of if we were to have a balance sheet, let's say, you you believe that it would be fair to say that it's far less likely for you to be disenfranchised and for you to be in a situation where you are suffering greatly as an artist. And at the same time, you do have more tools at your disposal, so to speak, to promote your music or to have different avenues to generate some revenue, some income for yourself as an artist. Would that be a fair picture of the landscape?
I would say that that's true. I would say
Okay.
that for individual artists, there are more possibilities now.
Mm.
There's a broader range of ways available to you to make a living than would have been the case in the past. That, however, I would hasten to add that that doesn't necessarily mean that the music world as a whole is in a healthier state than it was 100 years ago.
Okay.
I'm not making that.
Right. And you did mention right before that that it doesn't solve the problem. You believe of sort of being an artist of making a living as an artist. What do you think is that problem? What do you think it is? Is it just a lack of respect for art? What do you believe it is creating that issue?
It's something akin to an existential problem, and it might not be a solvable problem.
Mm.
The issue is that it's hard to monetize artistic creation because it's never obvious to contemporaries of the artist whether the work has any value or not. And often that doesn't become clear for decades or even centuries. So it would be akin to an entrepreneur coming to you and saying, I'm working on this extraordinary new technology that will probably take 100 years to get off the ground. Would you like to invest in my company? You're not going to see any benefits from your investment during your lifetime,
Right.
but your grandchildren and your great grandchildren might really benefit from it if it works out. That's basically what artists are saying. So obviously that's hard to monetize. Sometimes in rare instances, you have work that is both obviously well made and sophisticated and innovative, but that also has a popular component to it. It's extremely rare that those things really blend together. Mozart is an example of that. Mozart was able to write in the most sophisticated savant style of his day and also to speak the popular language of his society. Even Beethoven couldn't do that. Mozart was able to do it. That doesn't happen very often. So most of the time, you have something that is probably not broadly appealing. Um, and then you have to find a way to attract enough people that are interested enough in it to want to support it to try to cobble some kind of a living together. And that's a hard thing to do.
Right.
The other thing is that in the 19th century, there was a concept of the bourgeois audience, the audience that would go to symphony concerts, that would go to the opera. It would consist of people that were reasonably well educated, that probably played an instrument, that were fairly sophisticated and had some knowledge of what they were listening to. That's a broad caricature, and it's not
Of
always true,
course, yeah.
obviously. But there was a certain cohesion to that idea of the audience in quotation marks. In the 20th century and in the 21st century, you don't have the audience anymore. You have all of these little tiny splintered audiences that often have very specific tastes.
Mm.
So there's an audience for Baroque music. There's an audience um, for jazz. There's an audience for folk music. There's an audience for contemporary music. Some of those things overlap. Sometimes those circles can meet in the middle, but often they're really specialized audiences. So there is no cohesive middle class kind of audience idea at all anymore.
Right.
And so the odds that you're going to be able to make something and have it be broadly appealing are that much smaller now, I would say, because of that fact.
Simply because there's no sort of shared quote unquote language uh, or vernacular, let's say, of the music itself, you mean?
Well, let's look at it this way. Let's look at some broadly popular phenomena in popular culture.
Hmm.
Um, if you take a show like The Sopranos or Mad Men or something like that, that's probably about as successful as you can get in the popular realm today, I would argue. Um, what percentage of people between the age of 30 and 40 do you think have actually seen those shows?
Yeah.
It's not 100% of the population. It's not 80%. It's probably more like, it's probably less than 5%. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it were 1%,
Mm.
right? So, and that's something that's hugely popular,
Right.
right?
Right.
So imagine that a new blockbuster movie comes out and 10 million people see it. Like, what's 10 million people on the scale of North America?
Right.
So it's actually a small fragment of the population. So even things that are hugely popular are not going to. Whereas I think in the 1950s and 1960s, when there were only 2 or 3 channels on television, when there were far fewer movies being produced, if there was a huge popular success, everybody saw it.
Yeah.
A
Yeah. Yeah.
program like Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy or whatever, like those shows had a much larger audience share in their time
Right.
than a contemporary show would have today. So this is not just a thing that's limited to more esoteric branches of artistic production. It's the case with the popular arts as well.
So we spoke about people or artists who sometimes, very rarely, are able to bring in, let's say, very technical things and combine them with what's popular right now. Um, is there any such person or artist right now that you think is doing that? That comes to mind for you?
Yes, I can think of a few, but again, if you place them within the context of the entire culture, they're still reaching a very, very small number of people. I mean, the difference between people who are successfully doing that and the people who are really on the fringes is not actually that great. So in my world, the world of composition, I could point to somebody like Philip Glass.
Right.
Okay, so Philip Glass is a superstar in the world of composition. He's hugely famous. He's written a million pieces. He gets really high profile commissions. He's super productive. He's always writing 10 new pieces every year and so on. He's a by any measure, he's a huge success story in that world. The difference between someone like Philip Glass and someone like Helmut Lachenmann, who's much more on the fringes, who's writing really avant-garde and exploratory music, who writes a lot less. His pieces are not popular successes and so on, but he's also a really big name in that world. But he's got a smaller audience. But the gap between those things, I would argue, is actually not that great in terms of actual, if you want to say audience numbers and the number of people that are going to be familiar with the name and so on. It's still not the case that the majority of educated adults in the United States know who Philip Glass is. I don't think that's the case. Lachenmann is, of course, less than that. It's smaller. It's probably a lot smaller, but it's not that huge of a difference between those two things. So someone like Philip Glass, you could argue, has the popular dimension, and he knows how to market his music. Um, but he's still not an overwhelming popular cultural phenomenon in the same way that, let's say, Italian opera might have been in the 19th century, or that the mass marketed TV shows in the 1950s would have been. We don't have anything approaching that level of cultural saturation anymore.
Right. What would you say takes up most of your time now? What is your primary focus? Would it be teaching or still composition? Has anything
Oh,
shifted?
composition, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Composition. Yeah. That's why I do everything I do.
Okay.
The the creative impulse is number one. I'm trying to create things. I'm trying to invent new worlds. And everything that I do ties into that. So, which is not simply a lazy way of explaining why it is that I do so many things.
Right.
But so in a given day, I teach. I also have a teaching position in Germany, in Freiburg. I work on my podcasts and my YouTube channel, of course. Um, and well, I'm involved in putting together festivals, and I do recording projects. I do CDs. I work with a publisher very closely. I write books. I do all of these different things. They all feed into the composition aspect. So some of those things I do in order to be able to have, well, to be able to make a living, obviously, but also to have the necessary scaffolding in place so that I can sit down in a room by myself and write and not have anybody disturb me. You need you need a structure in place in order to be able to do that. So some of those activities, that's what their purpose is. And it's like you can choose your poison, right? You can either try to become a tenured professor, in which case you might not actually have very much time to write. You've got lots of stability and you've got a decent income, but you don't have much time to write.
Right.
Or you can opt for a somewhat more unstable life, um, but that gives you a little bit more freedom and a little bit more time to write. So I guess I've opted for the freedom approach, although what I'm trying to do now is to be able to generate enough revenue from all of my different activities so that I have a certain degree of freedom. I have the flexibility to decide what my projects will be, and I have more options. And I'm not saying that I've achieved that necessarily, but I'm a lot closer to that goal now than I was 5 years ago. And it seems to be on the path of continual improvement. So I'm optimistic that that can
Amazing.
be sustained.
Amazing.